Hey everyone. Tonight we begin in the back of a wagon, creaking down a rutted Georgia road. The summer air is thick with the smell of sweat and rot. You've been marching for days. 13 crackers your only food, and the men around you have stopped speaking. Ahead, the trees open to reveal a wall of timbers, high and silent, sealing in a darkness you can feel on your skin. You've heard rumors of Andersonville, a place where men are stripped to rags, where water runs brown with filth, and where the sun and rain fall on the dying without mercy. But the real camp, it was a machine that ground down the body and hollowed out the soul, built on neglect, guarded by indifference, and as relentless as hunger itself. If uncovering history's rawest truths helps you unwind, please like and subscribe. And tell me in the comments, where are you listening from? And what moment in your life felt like the longest day you've ever lived? Now draw close, settle into the dark, and follow me through the gates, into the place where every breath was borrowed. The wagon lurches to a halt, the sudden quiet more jarring than the incessant creaking. A guard barks an order, and the men around you stir, their movements slow and heavy. You are a Union soldier, and this is your arrival at Camp Sumter, a place the locals simply call Andersonville. The gate is not some grand entrance, but a raw, gaping maw in a wall of timbers. As you step down, your boots sinking into the soft, churned earth, the smell hits you first, a pervasive, sickening odor of human waste, unwashed bodies, and decay, so thick it seems to coat the back of your throat. It is a smell you will never forget, a constant companion. Then you see it. Not a fence, but towering stockade walls, perhaps 15 to 20 feet high, rough-hewn pine logs driven deep into the ground, sealing in this immense, suffocating space. They block out the sky, pressing in on you, silent and foreboding. The sun, a brutal, unforgiving presence, beats down upon the open yard, baking the red Georgia clay. Inside these walls, you realize, is not just a camp, but a crucible. The air hums with a low, collective groan, a sound that is part human, part animal. The chorus of 28,000 men crushed together. The earth beneath your feet is not merely dirt. It is churned mud, a perpetual mire created by countless shuffling feet and the endless cycles of rain and sun. Every step is an effort, your feet sinking, pulling free with a soft, sucking sound. Flies, a living, buzzing cloud, swarm everywhere. They dance over the open wounds you now notice on the men around you. Wounds that fester in the heat, untouched by care. You hear the coughs, ragged and deep, tearing through lungs. You hear the soft, continuous groans of suffering, punctuated by the rhythmic scrape of shovels against the earth. Each scrape is a hurried grave, dug for another man whose breath has finally given out. The sheer volume of human suffering is overwhelming. It is a presence, heavy and inescapable, a curse that hangs over this camp like a shroud. You have heard the numbers, the rumors, but seeing it, feeling it, you begin to understand the true horror. 13,000 men will die here. At its peak, the death toll will reach over 130 souls a day, a relentless, silent culling. You are now inside this machine, and a chilling realization settles over you. Cold as a winter wind, even the clothes on your back won't stay long. The day stretches into an eternity, marked only by the shifting angles of the merciless sun. You find a patch of ground, indistinguishable from any other, and sink down, your gaze sweeping over the landscape of despair. What strikes you most immediately, beyond the stench and the flies, is the utter destitution. You are not alone in your ragged uniform. The faces of the men blur into a sea of emaciation. But it is their bodies that truly tell the story. More than half of the prisoners, you observe, are nearly naked. Their skin, stretched taut over protruding bones, is exposed to the elements. Others are draped in mere scraps, tattered remnants of uniforms, little more than rags that offer no warmth, no protection, no dignity. The raw desperation is palpable. You see it in the way eyes scan, assessing, coveting, clothing, even the most threadbare, becomes a currency, a shield against the biting chill of the southern nights or the scorching sun of the day. A whisper of cold will pass through the camp, and you will hear it, feel it in your bones. In this place, the concept of a friend begins to unravel. The instinct for survival, raw and primal, gnaws at you, and you witness it gnawing at others. Men, once comrades, now steal from one another, a furtive hand slipping into a pocket, a sudden grab for a piece of cloth, a desperate, silent struggle over a threadbare coat, a worn-out shoe. These are not acts of malice, but of primal need, a tragic ballet of the starving. Most men here sleep bare to the sky, their bodies pressed against the damp, cold earth. The sun beats down in the day, baking their exposed skin, turning it red and peeling. The rain comes, a sudden, cold deluge, chilling them to the bone, turning the ground to soup. And then the night dew, a silent, pervasive wetness that seeps into every fiber, every pore. The lucky few. Those who arrived with ingenuity or a scrap of canvas might fashion lean-tos small, pathetic shelters cobbled together from discarded bits of wood, tattered blankets, or even scraps of old tenting. They offer scant protection, but they are a testament to the enduring flicker of hope, of the human desire for a modicum of comfort. You remember seeing him, a newcomer, not long ago. He arrived with a blue coat, a vibrant splash of color in this gray landscape, still crisp from his journey. He still held the posture of a soldier, a flicker of dignity in his eyes. But 3 weeks later, you saw him again, or what remained of him. The blue coat was gone, traded or stolen, leaving only his gaunt frame exposed. His skin was parchment thin, his eyes hollow, a distant, empty stare that seemed to look through you, beyond this world. The transformation was complete. The clothes were gone, and with them, a piece of his identity. You realize, with a heavy heart, that no clothes, no shelter, only one obsession remains: escape. The thought of escape, a tiny ember of defiance, flickers in the perpetual twilight of your mind. It's a whisper, a secret language shared between the desperate, a desperate hope against an overwhelming despair. You see it in the furtive glances, the quiet conversations, the subtle shifts in the landscape of the prison yard. The most common dream, the one whispered on the wind, is tunneling. At night, when the guards' patrols are more sporadic and the darkness offers a thin veil of concealment, the work begins. Men scratch and dig at the earth, their fingers raw, their bodies aching. The tools are whatever they can find: a broken spoon, a sharpened piece of wood, a fragment of metal. The dirt, the ever-present red clay, is the biggest challenge. It must be smuggled out, piece by agonizing piece. You see men stuffing pockets, trousers, even the tattered linings of their caps with handfuls of dirt. Then, as they shuffle through the yard in the pale light of day, they will subtly loosen their grip, allowing the earth to sift silently onto the churned mud, hoping it blends into the vast, indifferent landscape of the camp. It is a slow, painstaking process, requiring immense patience and a constant vigilance against the watchful eyes of the guards. A sudden movement, a telltale lump of earth, could mean an end to the dream, and perhaps a violent end to the dreamer. For the tunnel mouths, a different kind of camouflage is needed. The sick, the dying, become unwitting accomplices. You see men, feverish and weak, strategically positioned over the small, hidden openings during the day, their prone bodies concealing the precious work beneath. Their moans, their labored breathing, blend with the symphony of suffering that is Andersonville, drawing no special attention. It is a grim symbiosis the living, desperate to flee, use the dying as their unwitting shield. Some, in a final, desperate gamble, feign death. They lie motionless among the countless corpses waiting for burial, their bodies still, their breathing shallow. They endure the indignity of being handled like a sack of bones, carried out with the piles of the truly deceased, their hope to slip away in the cover of night, once they are outside the stockade walls. But most, the vast majority of those who try, are simply too weak. Their bodies, ravaged by starvation and disease, betray them. They are caught quickly, their gaunt forms no match for the armed guards or the lean, hungry dogs that patrol the perimeter. Or, if they manage to slip past, they collapse in the unforgiving Georgia woods, their strength giving out, their dreams fading into the rustling leaves. Then came the trigger event, a stark, brutal lesson etched in blood. A man, driven by a surge of madness or a profound act of despair, decided to scale the formidable 15-foot stockade wall in broad daylight. He clawed his way up, a defiant silhouette against the pale sky. The guards, perched on their elevated platforms, did not hesitate. Shots rang out, quick and sharp, echoing through the yard. His body tumbled, a broken doll, back into the churned earth. This act, this desperate attempt at freedom, led to the creation of something new, something even more sinister than the walls themselves. The deadline, from now on. You understand with a chilling certainty. A single wooden line means a shot straight to your heart. The deadline. The very word sends a shiver through you, cold and precise. It is not just a phrase. It is a physical manifestation of absolute power and indifference. After the desperate attempt to scale the wall, the Confederate guards implemented this new terror. Around the entire inner perimeter of the stockade, roughly 19 feet inside the main wall, they erected a line of wooden posts, each about 4 feet high. Across the tops of these posts, a thin slat of wood was nailed, creating a continuous, stark boundary. It was a line that ringed the entire yard, a visible, tangible boundary between the living and the dead. The standing order was unambiguous, delivered with a chilling clarity that left no room for misunderstanding. Shoot on sight anyone who touched or crossed that line. Accident or intent. It mattered not. A foot grazing the wood, a hand reaching out for support, a momentary lapse in judgment, any infraction was met with a swift, merciless bullet. You see the guards, perched high on their sentry boxes, their rifles resting easily in their hands, their eyes scanning, waiting. They are the executioners, and the deadline is their instrument. It becomes a constant, gnawing presence, a psychological weight that presses down on you, defining the limits of your world, the very space in which you can exist. You witness the grim reality of it. There was John Levi Mayle, a man already weakened by disease, his body trembling, his mind clouded by fever. As he shuffled through the mud, his strength failed him. He reached out, perhaps instinctively, for the nearest solid object, his hand brushing against the forbidden wooden slat. The crack of the rifle was instantaneous, shattering the humid air. He fell, a silent heap in the mud, his life extinguished in a heartbeat. And sometimes, you hear the distant thud of a stray ball, a bullet meant for someone else, striking an innocent bystander, adding another body to the ever-growing count. There is no justice here, only the cold, unyielding law of the deadline. The despair here is so profound, so suffocating, that it transforms the meaning of life and death. For some, the deadline becomes not a boundary to avoid, but a terrifying release. You see them, gaunt and hollow-eyed, their spirits broken, their bodies ravaged by hunger and disease. Shuffle deliberately towards the line. They walk with a grim resolve, their movements slow and deliberate, a silent plea for an end to their suffering. They step over, or simply touch the wood, their eyes fixed on the distant guard, waiting for the inevitable. The sharp report of the rifle is their final mercy, a faster exit from the slow, agonizing death promised by the constant ravages of disease. The deadline, you realize, is not just a killer. It is, for some, the only path to a peace they can never find within these walls. But if bullets don't finish you, hunger will. The gnawing in your stomach is a constant, unwelcome companion, a dull ache that sharpens with every passing hour. It is more than hunger. It is a deep, bone-weary emptiness that consumes your thoughts, your dreams, your very being. The rations, when they arrive, are a cruel mockery of sustenance. You learn to recognize the sound of the wagons, a brief, fleeting flicker of hope that is quickly extinguished by the reality of the distribution. Your primary food is cornbread, not the sweet, wholesome kind, but a coarse, gritty substance made from ground corn cobs, often mixed with the husks. Sometimes even bits of the cob itself. It is dry, tasteless, and provides little nourishment. It scratches your throat as it goes down, and you wonder if it is doing more harm than good. Beyond this meager bread, you might receive 4 tablespoons of rice per week. 4 tablespoons. It is a handful, barely enough to cover the bottom of your cupped hand. And on rare, almost miraculous occasions, a sliver of pork, often rancid, its smell thick and cloying, its taste bitter and unpleasant. Yet, you eat it. You eat every last crumb, every last grain, every last sliver, because it is all there is. The distribution itself is a chaotic, brutal affair. The rations are not handed out with care or consideration. They are simply dumped on the ground, often in a central area, left to be fought over. The guards watch, impassive. The strongest, the most desperate, rush forward, scrambling, pushing, tearing at the meager piles. The system is inherently unfair, designed for conflict, ensuring that the weakest, the most infirm, those who need it most, often get nothing. You see men, their eyes wide with a desperate hunger, reaching, grasping, only to be pushed aside, their hands coming up empty. You remember the journey here, the 5-day march through the unforgiving Georgia heat. Your entire sustenance for that brutal journey. Only 13 hardtack crackers, dry and hard as stone. Barely enough to keep a bird alive, let alone a marching man. You savored each one, breaking off tiny pieces, letting them dissolve slowly on your tongue, trying to prolong the illusion of food. Now, even that seems a luxury. Here, inside Andersonville, the desperation escalates. Fist fights erupt over mouthfuls of food. Raw, savage battles among starving comrades. You hear the grunts, the blows, the cries of pain, all for a scrap, a crumb, a fleeting moment of relief from the agonizing hunger. The constant hunger reduces you, and every man around you, to a primal state, where the bonds of camaraderie fray under the relentless pressure of starvation. You learn to be wary, to watch your back, even among those you once called friends. Even when you find food, the water will turn it into poison. The water, it is the most fundamental of needs, a promise of life that turns into a source of death. The camp is bisected by a single trench stream, a small tributary of Sweetwater Creek, which quickly became known as Stockade Branch. This single, precious waterway is meant to be the source of all liquid for the tens of thousands of men trapped within these walls. But it is not a pure, flowing stream. It is, in horrifying reality, an open sewer. You see it. You smell it, and you taste it. From the moment it enters the stockade, upstream from where the prisoners congregate, it is fouled. The camp's latrines, crude pits dug along the banks, overflow directly into the stream. The waste from thousands of men, their bodies ravaged by disease, flows freely, constantly, into the very water they are expected to drink. The water is always brown, thick with urine and feces, a swirling current of human filth. You see the film on its surface, the occasional grim detritus floating by. The stench is overpowering, a putrid, sickening odor that blends with the general miasma of the camp. And if that were not enough, you hear the rumors, whispered grimly from man to man, and you see the evidence with your own eyes, the guards, with a chilling indifference, reportedly dump filth deliberately into the stream further upstream, ensuring its complete contamination before it reaches the prisoners. It is a systematic act of cruelty, ensuring that the life-giving water becomes a conveyor of sickness and death. Prescott Tracy, one of the few who survived to testify, spoke of it later, his voice filled with a quiet horror. He described the water as the only source for drinking and cooking, the relentless source of endless sickness. Every mouthful is a gamble, every sip a prayer against the unseen enemies lurking within. You watch as men, driven by an unquenchable thirst, dip their canteens, their cups, their cupped hands into the foul liquid. You see them drink, their faces grim, their throats convulsing. And then, moments later, you see the inevitable progression of its effects. They double over, their stomachs cramping, their bodies racked with violent spasms. They lie down, their strength failing, their eyes dimming. And in this place, lying down is often the final act. They do not rise again. The water, meant to sustain life, becomes the most efficient killer in Andersonville, a silent, flowing grave. and if you're still breathing, the punishments will break you. Even within this living hell, where every breath is a struggle, where hunger and disease are constant torturers, there exists another layer of torment: the punishments. They are designed not just to control, but to break the spirit, to remind you of the absolute power held by your captors. Theft, driven by the desperate need for survival, is rampant. If you are caught, the consequences are immediate and brutal. You might be subjected to the stocks, your wrists and ankles clamped into wooden restraints, leaving you exposed to the elements, unable to move, a public spectacle of degradation. Or you might be forced to wear a ball and chain, a heavy iron sphere attached to your ankle by a chain, forcing you to trudge through the churned mud. Every step a painful, laborious effort. The weight drags at you, slowing you down, a constant, clanking reminder of your transgression. Then there is the collective punishment, a method of control that turns comrades against one another. If the roll call is short by even one man, perhaps due to a death unrecorded, an escape attempt, or a prisoner too weak to stand, the entire group, sometimes a whole company, loses its meager rations for the day. You feel the immediate fury, the raw frustration, as hundreds of starving men curse the unknown absent one, the one who stole their precious, life-sustaining food. It breeds resentment, suspicion, a tearing at the already fragile bonds that remain between men. The guards watch this internecine struggle with a detached amusement. Their control absolute. John L. Ransom, a survivor whose diary entries would later paint a chilling picture, recorded a particular incident that etches itself into your memory. A prisoner, burning with fever, his mind clouded by delirium, stumbled towards the deadline. His movements were not deliberate, not an attempt at escape, but the aimless wanderings of a man lost to his own suffering. A guard, observing from his perch, raised his rifle. There was no warning, no shouted command. The crack of the shot ripped through the air, sharp and final. The feverish prisoner crumpled, the bullet finding its mark directly in his skull. His death was instantaneous. In a camp where suffering is the norm, where the slow agony of starvation and disease promises a prolonged, hideous demise. Such a swift, brutal end can sometimes be viewed with a strange, dark envy. You see the glances exchanged, the quiet nods among the men. Some, in their deepest despair, regard it as a kinder death, a mercy compared to the slow, agonizing decay that is the common fate here. It is a chilling testament to the depths of suffering when a bullet to the brain can be perceived as a release. There's a place worse than the yard itself. They call it the hospital. You hear the whispers, the low, guttural moans that drift from the so-called hospital area, a place whispered about with a fear even deeper than the dread of the deadline. It is not a place of healing, but a waiting room for the grave, a final, horrifying stage in the Andersonville experience. Looking upon it, you see not clean beds and comforting hands, but rows upon rows of skeletal figures, lying directly on the ground, or on rudimentary, filthy straw pallets. The air here is even heavier, a sickening blend of putrefaction, unwashed bodies, and the cloying sweetness of decay. The numbers are a stark, unforgiving testament to its true nature. Between February 25th and May 9th, 1864, a mere 2.5 months, 588 men were admitted to this hospital. Of those, 26 died. That is nearly 1 in 4. A staggering mortality rate that speaks volumes about the utter lack of care. The complete absence of hope within its confines. You see the bodies, gaunt and twisted, lying motionless, waiting for burial. They are everywhere, piled like cordwood, silent monuments to the camp's relentless death toll. The flies, already a pervasive menace in the main yard, are a thick, buzzing veil here, a living shroud draped over the dying and the dead. They cover faces, settle on open wounds, crawl over unseeing eyes. The sound of their incessant buzzing is a constant, maddening drone, the soundtrack to despair. There are no coffins here, no ceremony, no gentle farewells. The ground is too hard, the bodies too numerous, the living too weak and too busy dying themselves. Prisoners, the ones still strong enough to wield a shovel, are conscripted to dig mass graves. They toil under the relentless sun, their bodies swaying with exhaustion, their minds numb to the horrors around them. These are not individual burials, but communal pits, where dozens of bodies are laid side by side, stacked in layers, covered quickly with earth, then forgotten. You hear the quiet, broken words of a prisoner doctor, a man whose medical knowledge is rendered utterly useless by the conditions. He mutters, his voice hoarse with despair. Entering here is entering the grave. It is not a place to recover, but a place to surrender, to finally let go of the last vestiges of life. The air is thick with the moans of the suffering, the delirium of fevered minds, and the soft, rasping breath of men taking their last. Here, even the flickering hope of survival is extinguished, replaced by a bleak acceptance of the inevitable. And then, in this hell, someone offers a way out. In the suffocating grip of Andersonville, where every moment is a battle against starvation, disease, and despair, a strange and unsettling offer begins to circulate, a whisper that cuts through the incessant drone of suffering. It comes from the Confederate command, a seemingly benevolent hand extended into the abyss, an offer of freedom. The terms are simple, stark, yet laden with a profound weight. You are told you can swear allegiance to the Confederacy, renounce your loyalty to the Union, take a sum of money, and walk free. It is a choice presented in the most agonizing of circumstances, life for your honor. Picture it in your mind, the scene unfolding with a dreamlike clarity in this nightmare. A skeletal prisoner, his uniform a collection of tattered threads, his face gaunt, his eyes sunken and dull with hunger, stands before a fluttering southern flag. The colors, unfamiliar and stark, seem to mock his predicament. On a rough wooden table, an oath lies, a piece of paper, a pen. The words are there, simple lines to sever the ties that once bound him, to pledge himself to the very cause that has brought him to this agonizing brink. The money, a small stack of unfamiliar bills, sits beside it, a tangible promise of food, shelter, a path away from this living tomb. The temptation, you imagine, must have been overwhelming. A searing beacon of hope in a sea of utter hopelessness. The gnawing hunger, the feverish chills, the relentless suffering, all of it could end simply by uttering a few words, by signing a name. It would be so easy to feign it, to take the oath with a hollow heart, to then slip away and flee, once beyond the walls, back to the Union lines, back to life. No one would know, save for your own conscience. But the remarkable, almost unbelievable testimony from those who survived paints a different picture. According to the accounts, to the memories of those who endured this test, none accepted. Not one. Despite the brutal reality of their situation, despite the overwhelming instinct for survival, the loyalty to the United States, the principle of their cause, outlasted the most primal urge to live. It was a silent, collective act of defiance, a testament to an inner fortitude that transcended the physical devastation. In the face of unimaginable suffering, they held on to their honor, their identity as Union soldiers, the last thread of dignity in a place designed to strip them of everything. Their refusal echoed silently across the vast, muddy yard, a powerful rejection of a life bought at the cost of their principles. When the war ends, the nation finally sees the hell that stood in Georgia. The war finally ends, the last distant echo of cannons fading into a fragile quiet. The nation, exhausted and scarred, begins the slow, painful process of healing. But for the survivors of Andersonville, the wounds run deeper than any battlefield injury. Their stories, delivered with halting words and haunted eyes, begin to emerge. Reports, detailed and horrifying, are compiled. And then, the photographs. Stark, unflinching images of emaciated men, their bodies living skeletons, their faces blank with suffering, are brought north. These visual records, raw and undeniable, ignite a firestorm of outrage across the Union. The full, unvarnished horror of what transpired in that Georgia field is finally laid bare for all to see. Walt Whitman, the poet of the people, captured the sentiment with a chilling simplicity that echoes through the years. There are deeds that may be forgiven. This is not among them. The scale of suffering, the deliberate cruelty, the sheer number of lives extinguished by neglect and design, seared itself into the national consciousness. It was a scar, a wound that festered long after the last shot was fired. The demand for accountability was immediate and fierce. Henry Wurz, the commandant of Andersonville, a Swiss immigrant who had overseen the camp, was arrested and brought to trial. The charges were conspiracy and murder, specifically for the deliberate mistreatment and neglect that led to the deaths of thousands of prisoners. The trial was highly publicized, a national reckoning. Wurz maintained his innocence, claiming he was merely obeying orders, a defense that would echo in future tribunals. But the weight of the testimony, the undeniable evidence of the death toll, proved overwhelming. In November 1865, Henry Wurz was found guilty and hanged, becoming the only Confederate officer executed for war crimes during the Civil War. His death was a symbolic closure, though it could never truly atone for the immense suffering he presided over. Yet, even in the aftermath, the echoes of division persisted. In 1908, decades after the war, the United Daughters of the Confederacy erected a memorial to Henry Wurz near the very site of the prison. It stands there still today, a granite obelisk, a stark reminder that even in the face of undeniable horror, different narratives can emerge, different interpretations of history persist. It is a quiet, yet powerful, testament to the enduring complexities of memory and loyalty. Today, if you were to visit the site of Andersonville, you would find a vast, somber landscape. The stockade walls are gone, replaced by a haunting silence. But the ground itself tells the story. Long, ordered rows of pristine white markers stretch into the distance, almost as far as the eye can see. These are not individual graves, but markers for the mass graves that hold the remains of the 13,000 men who perished here. Each small, white stone represents a life, a dream, a hope extinguished by the relentless machine of Andersonville. The wind whispers through the trees that have grown since, carrying with it the faint, lingering echo of a collective groan, a silent testament to unimaginable suffering. And as you stand there, looking out over that field of white, a profound, unsettling question rises in the quiet air. A question that lingers long after the sun has set. Could an Andersonville happen again, even now? The year was 1861. The American summer, as always, unfolded with a slow, deliberate grace. Days stretched long, filled with the hum of insects and the gentle rustle of leaves. Yet, beneath this veneer of pastoral calm, a profound tension had been building for months. A quiet, insistent drumbeat, ever since the cannon fire at Fort Sumter, had pierced the dawn. It was July now, a time when the sun beat down with a steady, comforting warmth, turning fields golden and skies a brilliant, cloudless blue across the vast expanse of the nation. But this particular July carried a different kind of heat, an internal combustion threatening to consume the very fabric of the young United States. From the quiet, tree-lined streets of Washington, D.C., a city still retaining much of its village charm, a grand army began to stir. Not yet the hardened, weary legions that would eventually crisscross the landscape for 4 arduous years, but a fresh, eager host. They were largely volunteers, answering a hurried call to arms. Under the command of General Irvin McDowell, a meticulous and thoughtful officer, this Union force, swelling to some 35,000 men, commenced its march, their destination Northern Virginia, just a short distance from the nation's capital, yet a world away in its political and emotional landscape. Imagine the scene, the slow, rhythmic thump of thousands of boots on dusty roads, raising a fine, pale cloud that hung in the still summer air. The sun, already climbing, cast long, wavering shadows behind the columns. Their uniforms, fresh and crisp, were still untainted by the grime of prolonged conflict. The air was thick with the scent of pine and rich earth, occasionally mingled with the metallic tang of new weaponry and the faint, almost imperceptible smell of apprehension. Each man carried not only his rifle and pack, but also a bundle of expectations, hopes, and, for some, a touch of youthful bravado. The march itself was a spectacle. This wasn't a stealthy advance, but a deliberate, almost ceremonial progression. Wagons rumbled, horses neighed, and the occasional burst of laughter or song would ripple through the ranks, quickly absorbed by the vastness of the landscape. They moved at a steady pace, covering perhaps a dozen miles on that initial leg of their journey. Each step carried them further from the familiar comforts of home and closer to the uncharted territory of armed conflict. The fields they passed were lush and green, the farmhouses quiet and still, their inhabitants often standing at fences, watching this monumental procession with a mix of curiosity and dread. For many of these soldiers, the furthest they'd ever traveled from their hometown was a neighboring county. Now, they were on a journey into the very heart of the conflict, a journey many believed would be swift and decisive. The whispers in the ranks, the confident predictions shared around evening campfires, all spoke of a single, glorious encounter that would somehow resolve the nation's agonizing divisions and allow them to return home before the autumn leaves began to fall. Such was the hopeful, yet profoundly naive. spirit of that long summer's dawn. Back in Washington, D.C., the air hummed with a different kind of tension. Not the physical strain of the march, but the immense weight of expectation that settled upon President Abraham Lincoln. From his quiet, often solitary office, he looked out upon a city pregnant with anticipation. The clamor for action had been growing louder each week since the ignominious start to hostilities at Fort Sumter. There was a pervasive, almost desperate belief among many, including the president, that this conflict, this grievous rupture in the national fabric, could be resolved with a single, decisive blow. One grand battle, a swift triumph, and the rebellious states would surely see the error of their ways, laying down their arms and returning to the Union fold. It was a hope born of desperation, a yearning for a quick resolution to what everyone knew, deep down, was an unthinkable division. The political pressure on Lincoln was immense, a constant, low-frequency hum in the background of every meeting, every decision. The Union Army, as it stood then, was largely composed of 3-month militia volunteers. Their enlistments, hastily signed in the immediate wake of Sumter, were rapidly approaching their expiration dates. If these men were to be used, if their raw enthusiasm and limited training were to be leveraged, it had to be now. The clock was ticking, a relentless, audible reminder of the precarious position the nation found itself in. There was a sense of urgency, a feeling that if the opportunity was missed, if this initial surge of patriotic fervor was allowed to wane, then the task ahead would become infinitely more complex, more costly, more prolonged. Lincoln, a man often cloaked in quiet contemplation, bore this burden with a stoic resolve. He was new to the intricacies of commanding such a vast military undertaking, new to the brutal realities of war. His understanding, like that of many, was shaped by history books and romanticized notions of heroic engagements. The idea of a short, sharp conflict wasn't just a political convenience. It was a psychological necessity, a way to avoid confronting the unthinkable prospect of a truly prolonged and devastating civil struggle. He saw the stakes clearly, the very survival of the United States as a unified entity. On one side, the Confederacy fought for the principle of self-determination, the right to secede and form their own nation. On the other, the Union stood firm on the principle of federal authority, the imperative to suppress what they saw as an illegal rebellion that threatened the fundamental ideals of the Republic. The air in the Capitol was thick with gossip and speculation. Newspapers ran headlines brimming with confidence, predicting imminent victory. Society balls continued, though perhaps with a slightly more somber undertone, and conversations in parlors and drawing rooms invariably turned to the war, to the brave boys in blue, and to the certainty that peace would soon return. There was a prevailing sense of a grand adventure, a temporary disruption before a return to normalcy. Very few, if any, truly grasped the profound, transformative horror that lay just beyond the horizon, waiting to reshape their lives, their nation, and their very understanding of war itself. This quiet optimism, this naive belief in a swift and glorious end, would prove to be one of the first casualties of the approaching storm. The war fever that gripped both North and South in that summer of 1861 was a peculiar, almost whimsical phenomenon. It was a fever born not of experience, but of imagination. For generations, conflict had been a distant echo, a romanticized notion culled from heroic tales and embellished newspaper accounts. The grim realities of battle, the sheer, visceral horror of it, were largely unknown to the general populace. There was no real battle photography to strip away the illusions. No stark images of mangled bodies or desperate retreats to shock the public conscience. Instead, war was largely imagined as an orderly affair, a grand chess match played out by valiant soldiers, a spectacle of flags and strategic maneuvers, where victory was glorious and defeat, if it happened, was a dignified retreat. This distorted perception led to a truly extraordinary scene on the outskirts of Washington. As news of the impending clash spread, a remarkable procession began to form, not of soldiers, but of civilians, senators and congressmen, their top hats gleaming in the summer sun. Piled into carriages, wealthy Washington elite, their wives adorned in their finest summer dresses, joined the impromptu caravan. They were headed for the front, not as participants or even concerned relatives, but as spectators. They packed picnic baskets, filled with delicacies, cold chicken, cheese, fresh bread, perhaps a bottle of wine or two. It was as if they were off to a grand sporting event, a day at the races, or a particularly thrilling exhibition. The atmosphere was one of excited anticipation, a social outing with the added thrill of witnessing history in the making. Imagine the dusty roads, already churned by the passage of troops, now further congested by these civilian conveyances. The air, thick with the scent of summer and the distant murmur of the marching army, was periodically punctuated by the laughter and chatter of these well-dressed onlookers. They found vantage points on nearby hills, spreading their checkered blankets on the grass, uncorking their bottles, and settling in for what they expected to be a splendid show. The very idea that they might be placing themselves in grave danger seemed not to occur to them. Or if it did, it was dismissed as an unlikely prospect in what was sure to be a swift and decisive Union victory. From their elevated positions, they could see the vast panorama of the battlefield unfolding below. The lines of soldiers, appearing almost like miniature toy figures, moved with a certain precision, their flags snapping in the breeze. The distant crackle of musketry might have sounded, to their ears, like a distant firecracker display, rather than the prelude to deadly conflict. They watched with a detached curiosity, discussing the movements of the troops, offering their own amateur analyses of the strategies at play. This was history. Yes, but it was also entertainment, a diversion from the polite routines of their lives. They had come to witness a spectacle, to cheer on their side, and to return to their comfortable homes with stories of the glorious day. Little did they know that the stage they had chosen for their picnic would soon be transformed into a terrifying crucible, and that the show they had come to see would descend into a chaotic, unimaginable nightmare that would forever shatter their innocent understanding of war. The gentle breeze that carried the sounds of distant preparations also carried the whispers of a coming storm. A storm that would rip away the veils of illusion and reveal the brutal, unvarnished face of conflict. As the long July morning matured, pushing temperatures ever higher, the first genuine tremors of battle began to ripple across the landscape near Bull Run Creek. General McDowell's plan, a thoughtful and seemingly solid strategy for outflanking the Confederate forces, was put into motion. The Union troops, after their long march, advanced with an initial surge of energy and determination. Imagine the sound, the collective intake of breath, the rustle of men moving through tall grass, the first scattering shots exchanged by skirmishers like pebbles thrown into a quiet pond. Then, the increasing crescendo of rifle fire, the sharp, percussive crackle that built into a sustained roar as regiments engaged. The initial hours brought promising news to Washington. In the telegraph office, a small, bustling room filled with the rhythmic click-clack of the telegraph keys. President Lincoln spent his Sunday in anxious vigil. The lightning messages, as they were called, began to trickle in, transforming the speed of battlefield news. No longer did reports take days or weeks to travel by horseback or ship. Now, within minutes, fragments of information, both hopeful and grim, could leap across the distance. Early dispatches suggested Union success. The initial pushes against Confederate lines indeed saw encouraging results. Federal troops crossed Bull Run Creek, their momentum carrying them forward, pushing back their Southern counterparts. For a fleeting period, the air in the telegraph office seemed to lighten, a cautious optimism taking root. Yet, even as these early successes were reported, a quiet, almost imperceptible tension underscored the Union effort. McDowell's plan, while intellectually sound, relied heavily on disciplined execution, a quality in short supply among his largely inexperienced troops. These were not seasoned veterans of countless campaigns, but citizen soldiers, many of whom had only held a rifle for a few weeks or months. Their movements, though initially spirited, sometimes lacked the fluid coordination essential for large-scale maneuvers. Orders, though clearly given, might be misunderstood or executed with hesitant slowness. The rigid formations taught in drill practice began to fray under the intense pressure of live fire. The sounds, too, were different from what they had imagined. The whirring whine of mini-balls, the deafening roar of artillery, the piteous cries of the wounded, these were sensory assaults that shocked the system, stripping away any lingering romantic notions of warfare. The summer sun beat down relentlessly, adding another layer of exhaustion. Men, unaccustomed to the rigors of battle under such conditions, found their energy flagging more quickly. They sweated profusely under their heavy wool uniforms, their throats parched, their muscles aching. Despite these nascent challenges, the morning belonged to the Union. They advanced, took ground, and scattered some of the Confederate units. The hopeful messages continued to arrive in Washington, painting a picture of an army on the verge of victory. For a few precious hours, the dream of a swift end to the rebellion seemed within reach. The early success was intoxicating, masking the subtle, insidious vulnerabilities that were slowly beginning to manifest, vulnerabilities that would soon be exposed with devastating clarity as the day wore on. The quiet promise of the morning would soon yield to the brutal reality of the afternoon. As the morning's fleeting successes gave way to the harsh glare of the afternoon sun, the shifting sands of battle began to betray the Union's initial gains. A subtle but profound change rippled across the Confederate lines, a transformation that would soon prove decisive. What had been a series of localized retreats and defensive maneuvers slowly coalesced into a determined rally. Imagine the growing murmur along the southern positions, the shouted commands of officers, the reforming of ranks, not in panic, but in stubborn defiance. It was a hardening of resolve, a tightening of grips on rifles, a quiet, furious energy building just beneath the surface. And then, a critical element, like a sudden, unexpected gust of wind, swept onto the field reinforcements. The relatively new technology of the railroad played a pivotal, almost cinematic role in this turning tide. From the south, trains laden with fresh Confederate troops, including those under the command of Brigadier General Joseph E. Johnston, steamed closer to the battle. As these troops disembarked, their ranks still relatively fresh, their spirits high. A palpable wave of renewed energy spread through the weary Southern defenders. It was a psychological boost, as much as a tactical one. The sight of these arriving forces, the sounds of their cheering, acted like a potent tonic, breathing new life into the beleaguered lines. The timing could not have been more critical. Just as the Union push began to falter from exhaustion and the inherent difficulties of coordinating inexperienced troops, the Confederate morale surged. A sense of confidence, perhaps even invincibility, began to settle over them. They saw not a losing battle, but an opportunity. The air crackled with a renewed determination. The defensive stance began to morph into an offensive mindset. For the Union troops, who had pushed hard all morning, the sight of these fresh enemy reserves was disheartening. They had expected to break the Confederate lines, to rout them decisively. Instead, they watched as new banners appeared. New faces took their place in the opposing ranks, and the weight of the enemy force seemed to grow rather than diminish. The fatigue that had been a quiet ache now became a heavy burden. The heat, which had been merely oppressive, now seemed to sap their very will. The sounds of battle, which had been receding, now grew louder, more insistent, closer. This was the moment when the pendulum of fate began its slow, deliberate swing. The strategic genius of McDowell's plan was eroding under the cumulative weight of fatigue, inexperience, and the timely arrival of Southern strength. The battlefield, once a stage for Union advancement, was now becoming a treacherous, unpredictable landscape where every step felt heavier, every breath more labored. The morning's hopeful light was slowly dimming, overshadowed by the ominous clouds of a gathering counterattack. The stage was set for the next, most terrifying act of this unfolding drama. An act that would shatter the fragile peace of the afternoon with a sound that would haunt the memories of those who heard it for years to come. And then, it came. A sound unlike anything heard before on an American battlefield, a sound that would forever etch itself into the collective memory of the soldiers and mark the true turning point of the day. It was the rebel yell. Imagine it not a coordinated cheer, not a battle cry in the traditional sense, but a high-pitched, piercing, almost banshee-like shriek. It was a sound born from the depths of the Southern soul. A primal, unnerving ululation that burst from thousands of throats simultaneously, rising above the din of musketry and cannon fire. Union troops, already weary from the morning's exertions and unnerved by the sudden surge of Confederate reinforcements, were utterly unprepared for this acoustic assault. They described it as otherworldly, inhuman, a sound to chill the blood. It was not the roar of an attacking army. It was something far more insidious, a sound designed not merely to express aggression, but to strike terror deep into the hearts of their opponents. It was a psychological weapon, as potent and destructive as any projectile fired from a rifle. This terrifying, high-pitched wail carried across the open fields, cutting through the heavy summer air with an almost physical force. For the Union soldiers, it was a sound that shattered their composure, a visceral shock to their already frayed nerves. Their formations, which had begun to waver under the pressure of the Confederate rally, now visibly trembled. It was not just the sound itself, but the sheer, overwhelming volume of it, the feeling of being engulfed by a tide of pure, unbridled fury. The Confederate counterattack, now fueled by fresh troops and surging morale, gained unstoppable momentum with the rebel yell as its terrifying soundtrack. They surged forward with renewed ferocity, their faces grim, their eyes alight with determination. The psychological impact of the yell was immediate and devastating. Union lines, already stretched and thinning, began to buckle. The disciplined retreat that officers tried to instill quickly devolved into a desperate scramble for safety. The battlefield became a maelstrom of sound and confusion. The rhythmic beat of marching feet gave way to the frantic pounding of running, stumbling men. The distinct crackle of musket fire blurred into a continuous, deafening roar. Amidst it all, the chilling echoes of the rebel yells seemed to follow them, a phantom presence clinging to the hot, humid air. For those Union soldiers, this was the moment when the dream of a swift victory evaporated, replaced by the grim, terrifying reality of a desperate struggle for survival. The unearthly cry not only signaled a tactical shift in the battle, it ripped away the last vestiges of innocence from those who heard it, introducing them to a new, brutal dimension of warfare they had never imagined possible. The day was turning, not just slowly, but with the sudden, terrifying speed of an unleashed tempest. The terrifying crescendo of the rebel yell proved to be the final, shattering blow to the already strained Union lines. Under the combined weight of the relentless Confederate counterattack, the unearthly screams, and the sheer exhaustion of a long day of fighting in the oppressive July heat, the Union defense finally gave way. The line, which had bent and swayed for hours, now snapped. What had been an orderly, if desperate, retreat transformed into a full-scale rout. Imagine the scene: thousands of men, their faces grimed with powder and sweat, their uniforms clinging to their bodies, their eyes wide with panic, suddenly breaking ranks. The discipline painstakingly drilled into them for weeks evaporated in an instant. Fear, a primal, contagious force, swept through the columns like wildfire. Soldiers, who moments before had been bravely holding their ground, now turned and fled. Their objective was no longer to fight, but simply to escape, to put distance between themselves and the terrifying, surging Confederate tide. The retreat was a scene of utter chaos and mounting desperation. Men stumbled over their own feet, over fallen comrades, over the uneven terrain. The ground, already churned into dust by the morning's march and the day's fighting, rose in great choking clouds with every frantic step. The summer sun, which had been a gentle warmth just hours before, now felt like a punishing, inescapable furnace, baking the ground and draining the last reserves of energy from their bodies. Thirst became an agony, a burning in the throat that made every breath a struggle. As they ran, they began to shed their burdens. Heavy wool coats, cumbersome knapsacks, canteens, even their precious rifles, all were cast aside, abandoned in a desperate effort to lighten the load and quicken their pace. The fields and roads became littered with the detritus of a defeated army, glinting bayonets, discarded cartridge boxes, scattered letters from home, a poignant testament to the sudden collapse of order and hope. The clatter of abandoned equipment mingled with the sounds of their own ragged breathing and the distant, pursuing shouts of the victorious Confederates. The roads, the very arteries meant to facilitate their advance, now became congested arteries of retreat. What had been a column now became a surging, terrified mob, pushing and shoving, each man focused solely on his own escape. The sense of camaraderie, of being part of a unified force, dissolved under the crushing weight of panic. It was a raw, visceral experience of defeat, far removed from the romanticized notions of battle they had held only hours before. For the Union soldiers, the afternoon at Bull Run was not just a military loss. It was a profound, deeply personal unraveling. A sudden and brutal lesson in the true, terrifying nature of war. The quiet, hopeful morning had vanished, replaced by a desperate, breathless flight under the unforgiving gaze of the setting sun. As the defeated Union Army began its chaotic retreat from the fields around Bull Run, a new, equally disorienting element was added to the already unfolding disaster: the civilian spectators. These well-dressed men and women, who had arrived earlier in the day with their picnic baskets and eager expectations, suddenly found themselves caught in the very maelstrom they had come to observe. What had started as a leisurely outing quickly devolved into a terrifying flight for survival. Imagine the scene on the roads leading back towards Washington, D.C. These very same thoroughfares, which had been filled with optimistic soldiers marching forward and cheerful civilians making their way to the show, now became a choked, swirling torrent of humanity. The retreating soldiers, their faces etched with exhaustion and terror, collided with the elegant carriages and bewildered civilians. The shock of the collapse was immediate and absolute for the onlookers. Their picnic blankets, once spread so carefully on the grass, were now abandoned, covered in dust. Their baskets, once brimming with food, were overturned, their contents scattered across the road. Carriages, many still adorned with ribbons and flags, became obstacles in the frantic escape. Some overturned, their occupants spilling onto the ground amidst the panicked soldiers. Horses, startled by the chaos and the shouts, reared and plunged, adding to the general pandemonium. Women, their fine dresses now soiled and torn, shrieked in terror. Men, who had been discussing strategy and predicting victory only hours before, now scrambled for their own safety, their faces pale with shock and disbelief. The retreat was no longer just a military maneuver. It was a human stampede. Soldiers, driven by an instinct for self-preservation, pushed past the bewildered civilians. The sight of these defeated, disarmed, and terrified men, their uniforms stained, their faces haggard, was a stark, immediate revelation for the civilian spectators. The war they had imagined as an orderly spectacle had, in a horrifying instant, revealed its true, brutal face. They were no longer spectators. They were refugees, swept up in the tide of a crushing defeat. The roads, already rutted and dusty, became a tangled mess of broken wheels, abandoned possessions, and desperate humanity. The summer heat, which had contributed to the soldiers' exhaustion, now beat down on this chaotic exodus, adding to the misery. The sounds of distant gunfire, which had once seemed almost festive, now carried a chilling, ominous echo. The air filled with the cries of the wounded, the shouts of the panicked, and the rhythmic thump of thousands of desperate feet. This collision of two worlds, the naive, civilian dream of war and its stark, terrifying reality, was a moment of profound disillusionment. The journey back to Washington, which had begun with such light-hearted optimism, became a harrowing testament to the sudden and devastating end of innocence. A journey that would forever alter the perception of what war truly meant. As twilight began to paint the sky over Washington, D.C., a grim procession began to stream back into the nation's capital. These were not the triumphant soldiers many had so confidently predicted would return. Instead, exhausted and disarmed Union soldiers, their faces gaunt, their eyes hollow, trickled back into the familiar streets. They came in small groups, sometimes alone, their uniforms torn and soiled, their heads bowed in profound defeat. This was defeat. not as a distant headline, but as a palpable, heartbreaking reality arriving directly at the city's doorstep. The public, who had been waiting with bated breath for news of victory, was suddenly confronted with the raw, undeniable truth. The streets, which had buzzed with anticipation and confident chatter, fell quiet as the first trickles of defeated men appeared. Then, as more arrived, the quiet turned into a murmur of disbelief, then a rising tide of shock. People stood on their porches, in their doorways, on the sidewalks, watching this somber parade of shattered hopes. The reality of defeat was not just seen, it was smelled. The scent of sweat, dust, and something far more disturbing, the faint, acrid smell of gunpowder, of blood, of human despair clung to the weary men. It was the smell of war, unromanticized, unfiltered. It mingled with the familiar aromas of the city, creating a jarring, unsettling contrast. For many, this was the first time they had ever witnessed, firsthand, the physical manifestation of military failure, the tangible evidence of human suffering on a grand scale, the bravado, the patriotic fervor, the naive belief in a swift and easy victory, all crumbled in the face of this stark visual and olfactory evidence. Meanwhile, in the quiet, tense atmosphere of the telegraph office, President Lincoln was experiencing his own, more immediate, and no less bitter lesson. The lightning messages that had brought the initial, hopeful reports now brought the devastating news of the turning tide, the collapse, and the chaotic rout. He received the dispatches in near real time, each click and whir of the telegraph machine hammering home the unfolding disaster. It was a new kind of warfare, one where the consequences of battlefield decisions arrived almost instantaneously, without the softening filter of time or distance. Lincoln, a man of profound empathy, felt the shock of this direct, immediate wartime failure deep within his soul. The hope for a swift resolution, the strategic belief in one decisive battle, shattered before his very eyes. The image of the grand Union Army, marching with such confidence, was replaced by the stark, unvarnished reports of panic and flight. This was not a defeat he could intellectualize or distance himself from. It was a raw, personal blow. He saw the enormity of the task ahead with sudden, chilling clarity. The defeat at Bull Run was more than just a military setback. It was a profound national disillusionment, a brutal awakening to the true nature of the conflict that lay ahead, and a heavy, sorrowful burden for the quiet man in the White House. As the exhausted sun finally dipped below the horizon, casting long, somber shadows over a stunned Washington, D.C. and the battle-scarred fields of Virginia, the full weight of the day's events settled upon the nation. The defeat at Bull Run, or Manassas, as it was known to the Confederates, was more than just a single lost battle. It was the definitive end of illusions. The pervasive, deeply held belief in a short war, a swift and clean resolution to the national crisis, collapsed utterly and irrevocably. The optimistic pronouncements, the picnic baskets, the cheering crowds all seemed impossibly distant now. Remnants of a naive, bygone era that had ended abruptly that afternoon. The quiet of the ensuing night was a heavy one, pregnant with the unspoken realization that the struggle ahead would be long, brutal, and costly beyond anyone's prior imagining. In the North, the initial shock gave way to a grim determination. The romanticized image of war, nurtured by generations of storytelling, was stripped away, replaced by a sobering understanding of its terrifying reality. Recruitment drives would intensify, and the call for longer enlistments would become a necessity. The nation, in its pain, was forced to confront the immense task of building a true professional army, one capable of enduring years of sustained conflict. In the South, a wave of elation swept through the Confederacy. Their victory, against what they had seen as overwhelming odds, bolstered their confidence and solidified their resolve. It seemed to confirm their belief in their cause, their fighting spirit, and their ability to defend their nascent nation. Yet, even in victory, a subtle shift occurred. The taste of battle, for all its triumph, also carried a hint of the grimness to come. The initial belief that one great victory might end the conflict was replaced by the understanding that their independence would be hard-won, requiring sustained sacrifice for both sides. The events of that sweltering July day laid bare the immense chasm that separated them, a chasm that could only be bridged through years of bitter fighting. The raw courage displayed, the terrible casualties incurred, the sheer scale of the chaos all spoke to a conflict of unprecedented ferocity. The very landscape around Bull Run, once peaceful pastures and rolling hills, was now scarred by the passage of armies, a silent witness to the day's profound transformation. And so, as the stars began to appear in the vast, quiet summer sky, a new chapter in American history truly began. The echoes of the rebel yell and the screams of the wounded faded into the night. But the quiet understanding they left behind would linger for years. The nation, North and South, had woken from its dream of a quick resolution. The long, arduous road of the Civil War stretched out before them, a path shrouded in uncertainty, but no longer in illusion. And perhaps, somewhere in that quiet reflection, there was a faint, shared sigh, a collective acknowledgement of the immense, sorrowful journey that now lay ahead for a divided land.